Good morning.
Just lost the screen for some reason.
You might be unplugging it.
Oh, cool.
So just a couple quick announcements. The next talk's about to start in a couple minutes here. The HeboCon robot battle is also starting right now in the Hardware Hacking Village. After this talk is the lunch break and intro to lockpicking in the Lockpicking Village. After lunch, the next talk starts. Sorry, I drank a bit. The next talk starts at 1300 back in here. Later today, some of the other events we have going on are the Fail of Things in the IoT Village at 3 o'clock and the Resume Workshop in the Hardware Hacking Village also at 3 o'clock. If you are participating in any of the contests, Tamper Evident contest in the Lockpicking Village ends at 4 o'clock, and Capture the Flag in the Capture the Flag room also ends at 4 o'clock. At 5 in this room, we have the closing ceremony, so come heckle the staff while we heckle back. And after that, we're all going to go to the 23B shop over in Fullerton for our official after party, which is lots of fun. If you have any questions, please ask us at Reg. Just checking here. Some of the other stuff we have, our shirts are for sale. The 2018 LayerOne shirt is $20 over at registration. If you want the DVDs, or a flash drive, I should say, of these talks for all the days, as well as the 2 workshops we had for InfoSec stuff yesterday and today, they are available from Todd in the back for $40. So see him at the end of the day if you want all the talks, or see him right away if you want specific talks. Other than that, there is a pinball competition in the chill out room, so I believe I have the high score, and nobody wants me to win because I'll never let you forget it. So go beat me. Otherwise, up next, we have Matthew Stits with From Security to Risk, Shifting the Focus and Changing the Conversation.
Hi, everyone. How are you doing? Good? So, hello and welcome. The talk, From Security to Risk, Shifting the Focus and Changing the Conversation. You could also consider this talk, How Not to Be an Asshole. So I'm Matthew Stits, usually just Stits. I've been in security and participated in the industry in one way or another for the past 20 years or so. I've worked as a network security engineer, a QSA, consultant and architect for a number of Fortune 500 companies in finance, casino gaming, security manufacturing, and other industries. I'm currently a security architect and researcher at Adobe, focused on emerging trends and technologies. So who's this talk for? People looking to establish a risk appetite, or people looking to shift away from risk avoidance, shifting from culture of blaming to learning. This also means fundamentally not having crazy what-if scenarios that you sometimes see in certain security practices. Having an honest conversation around where resources should be applied, e.g. protection versus correction versus optimization. But I also wanted to explain why we're having the talk in the first place. I've had 2 fundamental events in my career that really changed my life. The first one was on Wall Street, working for a high-frequency trader, where I was like so many people in security. I wasn't aligned with the business. I didn't understand why we were doing certain things. We were doing a major data center migration that just didn't make sense from my perspective at the time. It seemed like we were incurring a lot of operational debt, a lot of technical debt. A lot of my colleagues had some general contempt for and frustration towards the business and their approach towards security. And then I had an epiphany to go over my management and talk with senior directors and ask to go to lunch with them and really understand why we were doing the project the way we were doing it, and why we were moving so fast and loose with certain security components, and why that was acceptable when they were incurring significant technical and operational debt. And the answer was pretty humbling. It was fundamentally that the senior directors had looked at the project, assessed that it was going to make about $300 million in the first year, that they were going to spend $5 million, and that each one of us literally had something in the area of a 30-to-1 return on investment, and that we could incur that operational and technical debt for at least the next 3 years and still be profitable and deal with the SEC and all the other components towards the business. I thought that was really fascinating, where I was understood how I was a cog in a machine. And it was kind of cool to see where I was as a cog in the machine. And then I could suddenly speak to these people about why some of this operational and technical debt might be far more significant than they thought. It allowed me to help adjust the ship just a little bit in favor of what I was doing, and have a more mature conversation with everyone. The next one was, the next one was with a board member at a major casino gaming company, where I sat down and started going over some of the math related to security for the business. And we were talking about conventional physical security as well as some operational security. And he eventually just looked at me and he said, you realize we have guns, right? Like, at the end of the day, this is a cash business. Some of what you're saying, I know it's important. We probably do need to spend several $100,000 in this one area. But fundamentally, in this business, we have guns. And I found that really fascinating. And that man I ended up actually reporting to, and who was a board member, and reporting to the board quarterly. And it was probably one of the most interesting positions I've ever had in my life. So the problem, as I viewed it at the time, as I still view it today, your CFO and probably your COO views the security department as a black hole of money and bullshit. Traditionally, a COO looks at your operational debt and says, what the hell are you doing? All you're doing is delaying projects. Even if there's a security from the start initiative, what's going on here? You keep asking for more money. I'm not seeing any return on investment here. You're just a cost. You're just an expense to me. At best, you're usually a mitigation for an insurance policy. I realize there's eventually going to be a breach. I realize I might be hacked. I probably am hacked somewhere. Fundamentally, I've hired you because you're an expert in the field, but also because I realize I can get an insurance payout if something goes sideways. This is the only bullshit slide I have in the entire talk. but really, I'm serious. A lot of your C-level management really does have that perception if you talk to them candidly. They don't understand necessarily what's going on. They don't, from a security perspective, it hasn't been communicated to them well. And they tend to just view it as, okay, I'm cutting $15 million a quarter to this part of the organization, and I realize that's because I have a $500 million insurance policy for a worst-case scenario. And again, this is my only stupid graphic in the whole presentation. So again, I really want to emphasize this. Your department's viewed as an expenditure, not as an investment. And fundamentally, as a business, they're there to make money. They really view the entire department as a financial cost of doing business. It's one of these strange catch-22s where you realize you can do better than that. More often than people admit, it becomes a situation where people tend to either neglect security or dismiss you when you're having a conversation. People's eyes gloss over. Most of you have probably seen that when you're talking to senior management. They either stare at something else, they change the conversation, they interrupt. And it's usually because the relationship's already broken. And they're fundamentally necessarily nothing wrong based on what they're seeing, to be clear, either. One of the most common things I've ever had as a consultant going into a Fortune 500 company and speaking with an executive is our stock price has tripled over the last decade, something to that effect. I don't see where these security scenarios you're discussing have impacted my business. We talked TJ Maxx, we talked Target, and one of the most interesting things that ever came back to me from a retailer was, it's counterintuitive, but I invest in stocks when they're breached. Because the market overreacts, they get an insurance payout, and then their stock goes back up with a correction, and often analysts even are more aggressive on what the alpha is for that stock going forward in the market. So that being said, the problem also is that InfoSec is viewed as a compliance checkbox or an insurance requirement. This could be PCI SOX, what have you. Again, just the cost of doing business. So again, it's viewed as the problem, not the solution. Fundamentally, you're just viewed as another obstacle to business, as I've said before. I really want to emphasize that. That's something that can change, it needs to change. And the best way to do that is fundamentally with communication, aligning with the business, and focusing on empirical evidence. I can't emphasize that enough. Start speaking with people, have candid conversations. Don't be afraid to go 4 times over your level in an organization if you want to. That's one of the things that's benefited me more than anything, was to not stop at a director, not stop at a VP, but send an email to a C-level executive and say, hey, can we have lunch at some point in time? I know you're incredibly busy and you're probably in Asia right now, but when you're back in North America, can we sit down and really talk about what I'm doing and how I can align this better with the business? One of the best things that I did every time I was in a situation with that is fundamentally, and this is going to sound a little silly, but I'd recommend it to anyone here when you're speaking to C-level management or you're going to have a meeting with them. On a piece of paper, and I do this to this very day if I'm having a meeting with people that are at that level, I always bring a notepad with me and I write the following things on a piece of paper. This meeting's for them, it's not for you. Wait 5 seconds and think before answering any question. If you don't know something, just say it. Don't pause, don't hesitate, don't think about the problem. Just say you don't know it and you're going to research it and get back to them. And follow up. Keep following up with those components. And write down any question that you're about to ask and refine it. Spend the 15, 20 seconds on that question and make it as succinct as possible so you don't have a rabbit hole with an executive. Again, start having those conversations based on, I'm going to say empirical evidence again, and you'll understand that in a second why I'm saying that, but it's really important. Far too often in threat modeling or in general conversations, we talk about really high-level theoreticals, or we don't necessarily talk about mitigations in a strong way. Also have empathy. This is going to sound a little strange, but understand the people that you're talking to, just as you have passions in security, have just as much passion for finance, for marketing, for project management, for sales, for a ton of other things in the business. And sit down with them, try and have regular lunches, things like that, and don't talk about security. Talk about their part of the business. Literally go to lunch and let them do 90% of the talking. I can't stress that enough. Have empathy with where they're coming from and what they're trying to accomplish, as opposed to saying, I need EDR on every device and I need to lock it down and only these hashes can execute, et cetera. Like, start talking to them about what they're doing, what they're passionate about, why they got in the business in the first place, and then focus on empirical evidence everywhere. Every time you're having a conversation with someone, you should be able to either cite a white paper, cite some statistical materials out of Splunk, something like that, ELK, whatever your choice might be, but cite actual hard evidence, hard numbers. And then establish a process, even if it's an awful process at first, but establish a process. I can't stress that enough. You're going to crawl, you're going to walk, and then you're going to run. And that process might be messy at first, but communicate it, start adopting it, get feedback, accept how brutal it might be, and keep refining that process that you're using and try to apply it to the rest of the business in terms of how you're interacting with the business. And then again, reach out and start building relationships with everyone. Great people to start with are internal audit and legal. To this day, I would say I probably spend half of my time with legal. That is by no means an exaggeration. Once you get to a certain level in most businesses, you'd be amazed how much legal is the engine that drives the decision-making process, and that greatly affects you as security, both as an implementer and as a contributor. And then start with adapting process. Even if it means that awful process that you might have started with when you're communicating with people in the business. And I want to reiterate that crawl, walk, run scenario. It's really important. You need to start somewhere. Don't be ashamed to have a crappy process at a Fortune 500, a Fortune 500, a Fortune 1. Who cares? You could be working at Walmart. You could be working at General Electric. It really doesn't matter. People will respect that you're applying something there and probably want to contribute. Even if it's something as simple as a threat times vulnerabilities times consequence equals risk. One thing I will note with that statement is that is definitely overly simple, and that should be treated as a model that's not a mathematical equation. I want to make that really simple. There's dozens of these. Find the one that works for you and works for your business initially. So here's a simple risk scenario. Let's start with something really simple here, like something around antivirus. So you've had 15 malware cases this year or in the last year. Each case costs $5,000 to address or mitigate. That's a $75,000 impact to the business. You have 40,000 endpoints with AV costing $20 per agent per year. That's a pretty realistic price for most enterprises. If you're, take your pick, EPO, et cetera, Symantec, it doesn't matter. We all know that AV is kind of a joke, but hear me out here. So then, what does that fundamentally mean? That's a worst case scenario. That means that those 15 machines could have led to roughly a $450,000 loss to the business. That starts to give you some values to work with. It also means that you're spending more on AV than just using like the default Windows Defender and ripping AV off a Mac. Like fundamentally to the business, you just had a clear piece of evidence where you can say, we can get rid of AV on our endpoints. This is an acceptable risk. Suddenly we can actually have some really clear evidence here to say we're going to save you $350,000 a year. And we can spend that money maybe in a smarter play on like an EDR solution for servers versus endpoints. And also look at process and some other operational components where, I mean, that's fundamentally, if you look at those numbers, that's what? Somewhere between 3 and 8 engineers, depending where you are in continental North America. That's a lot of money. The other thing is start fundamentally presenting your data visually and repeating that over time. Consistently show deltas. A simple risk impact radar chart like this, showing the different operational components of most security practices within an organization. I can't tell you how many board meetings I've been in and shown something like this, and then come back the next quarter, and the next quarter, and the next quarter, and then have like yearly summaries, and people say, oh, wow, we really can see here where IR benefited dramatically from this, where compliance participated, and we saw an overall change in the posture to the business, where architecture was suddenly contributing, and we went from having, in some cases, a 12-month plan or like an ad hoc purchase was our architecture practice, to a 36-month plan for the business that involved mergers and acquisitions and other components, and it really shows how healthy the internal security practice is for your organization. And I would say additionally, this is a huge tool to focus on continuity of business. That's something that a lot of people, especially in security, get driven crazy by, is you go from one team to another and none of your controls even map necessarily. But when you start having things like this and start having some really strong playbooks and start using that evidence, it really can help force that continuity of business conversation. So from there, again, start partnering with the business, demonstrating further value. A lot of what we've just discussed here leads to a lot of interesting conversations around how you can start to be viewed as a value add to the business. I can't stress that enough, that value add to the business. Your tools and your visibility into the business can start to lead towards both business and operational intelligence. For example, like site reliability engineers, if you work closely with them, some of your dev teams, especially like a CI/CD model, you're going to start to have all of this visibility that you can start communicating to them that allows them to finally change possibly how they're working and have a closer relationship, especially when it comes to operations. HR also might want to have a talk with you around network traffic, for example, like recreational flows, having QoS policies, things like that. That's another thing that's really valuable, where before HR just viewed you as potentially the IR component, or when there was a he said, she said, suddenly it's, hey, so what are you seeing on the network? Well, you're going to laugh, but we're seeing like Xbox traffic, or we're seeing like PS4s, or we're seeing a lot of Pandora or what have you. And if we look at the bandwidth cost associated with this, in some cases this isn't an exaggeration, Pandora, for one business I worked for, cost them in terms of bandwidth about $300,000 a year. Something to think about. But those are the things that you can really start to move forward with data like this. So that brings me to ROSI. Has anybody here ever heard of ROSI? Return on Security Investment? Cool. Oh. So ROSI is an emerging trend in security, especially at the architecture or at the financial practice components. It's probably an accounting standard by this point in time for most Fortune 500 companies. It's really getting us towards a more mature perspective where your CISO, your directors, your COO and CFO are getting into a room quarterly and really understanding how security is contributing to the business. So there's some fundamental components here. There's single loss expectancy. There's annual rate of occurrence. That's a percentile. Those two are then multiplied together to produce an annual loss expectancy, followed by risk mitigation. That's a percentage, which pretty much means how successful is your solution at actually defending against threats in the real world. And then the solution cost. So let's go through a really simple scenario. This is fundamentally what this looks like. And this is a model that, if any of you deal with risk and a day in, day out basis, this is something you'll see in Archer. You'll see people plugging stuff like this into Splunk. Anything where you have business intelligence. Some people use this for user behavior analytics components. It varies. But let's go through a scenario that I think might be pretty beneficial to really dig into this. So let's say that you have a firewall situation where you have a sandbox license. And in the past year, 10 viruses evaded all other mitigations that your testing shows that a sandbox would have caught it. The average cost of each incident was around $20,000 after you factored in labor, the loss of business, and other factors. Testing shows the sandbox caught roughly 83% of the samples that you have from those incidents. And again, it costs around $100,000. So applying that, you can go 10 times 20,000, so you have 200,000 times 0.83 minus 100,000 divided by 100,000. That's roughly 100, that is 160%. This is the precipice where you should actually start purchasing something. If you're not over 150%, probably when you factor in everything for the business and you start looking at the cost of it over time, it's probably not valuable. As an ideal situation, it's more like 240%, 260%. But actually using this math consistently over time and showing it to the business, I can't stress how valuable that is. Especially when you suddenly take a scenario like this and you provide the business with, let's say, 5 solutions like A, B, C, D, E, and use the same math and start showing them, that's where things can get really interesting. And the other part of this too is going back, if you have like a proof of concept or you're having a bake-off, start showing this math to your manufacturers that you're looking to purchase from. That really changes the conversation dramatically. And they start to shift their cost for this model. And you start seeing, I mean, EDR in particular, EDR is a really hostile environment these days, as is like network security in terms of the competition. You can in some cases see like a cost savings of between 70 and 80%, where they suddenly look at this and say, okay, we realize that our entire negotiation with you is imaginary money at this point in time, let's make it real. And they go back and forth, and you can start to see some real cost savings with your manufacturers. So in conclusion, I'd like to thank all of you for your time. I realize this is a short talk. I talked a lot faster than I thought I would. But I would say if you want to continue having conversations on this, any book by Hubbard is amazing when it comes to risk. There's a book called Against the Gods, talking about the history of risk in business. I'd really recommend checking that out. And again, anything from Hubbard. And Hubbard's a very cynical author, talks about the failures of risk management in business and how it really didn't do us any favors pretty much until the early 2000s in terms of how the models were constructed, how people were calculating them, et cetera. But anyway, I found those to be insightful, and I'd like to thank you all for your time. And if you have any questions, comments, I'd love to take them right now and have that conversation. No one? Hey.
What was the book you mentioned? Against?
Oh, Against the Gods? But that being said, I hope this... Yes, sir?
I wonder if you can speak to some of the costs per incident that you came up with.
Sure. So that's actually a really great question. And what it fundamentally comes down to is if you have IP theft, that's a different thing. IP theft, like legal's involved, there's separate math that usually goes into that, and an actuary is involved. For anyone that doesn't know, an actuary is the person at an insurance firm that calculates your premiums and how they're going to pay out. But most of that math is operational debt. So I couldn't have employees that were working. I had to have people working on re-imaging machines. I had to have IR people working on it. And you calculate all of that labor plus the time that was incurred. In some cases, you have to purchase additional hardware, things like that. That does happen once in a blue moon. Like you just tell someone because of your MDM profiles for an enterprise, you'll say okay, we realize you're down. Go buy a Chromebook. Go to Best Buy. Buy a $900 laptop. Put it on the P card. And then they connect back, get their MDM software, everything populates, and they keep going, but then they FedEx the previous box in. But that's fundamentally all it really comes down to is what did we lose here? In some cases, you also factor, if it's like a salesperson or something like that, that becomes sometimes a much bigger deal, where you're suddenly factoring in like their sales pipelines and things like that. But any other comments, questions? Shoot.
Why do you spend more time with legal? Can you explain more on that?
Sure. So legal tends to drive a lot of business process, especially around contract law, especially around IP, and around the controls around that. Another thing also is they want to know if there's going to be any potential litigation around privacy concerns, around how people might react to it. Like if we make these changes and we have this visibility, could it lead to a class action lawsuit? That's a very extreme example, but that is something that comes up. But what it fundamentally, I would say, comes down to is legal's the gatekeeper. The larger your business is, the more of a probability that it's run by legal. This might surprise you, it might not, but a lot of executives have JDs. A lot of executives are lawyers, fundamentally, and a lot of them speak legal at pretty consistent. They're either MBAs or JDs. And what you'll find consistently is they view a legal form of process or a narrow form of thought as a cost savings and a way of keeping things, don't laugh, but usually what you'll hear the first time you're talking to lawyers is this is a prophylactic measure. This is an insulating measure. This is a protective measure. And that's really how they view security. Did that answer your question, or do you want me to go into more? Okay. Shoot.
How long did it take you to kind of become aware of this was the way to go?
10 years. It literally took me I was in New York City cursing, working on a high-frequency trading project where they had just said that they were going to rip out their firewalls and hire 6 analysts because they couldn't afford 30 milliseconds of latency. And that was the breaking point where it was either I'm stupid or they're really, really smart. And I don't know which it is. I need to have this conversation. And my manager's no, just do your job. And I'm no, I'm going to send an email to your senior director. And I really want to understand this.
And follow-up to that, what do you mind? Kind of mentioned, you kept saying, you know what, I'm having problems with this layer 8 stuff. You kind of told me.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, do you think, there's no shortage of pen testers, no shortage of hackers. Do you think there's a shortage of people that are actually bridging the gap?
I do, and I'll say it's not worth necessarily going into, but for a year and a half I worked as a pen tester, and I was shocked at how adversarial that would come. I would literally have people say, well, is this really a risk, or is CVSS actually accurate here, or you've just come to me with, this is an extreme example, but I found one case where I literally pretty much just handed them a Metasploit database when I was done, and I gave them some just basic findings, and but maybe not basic findings. I addressed the 10 general criteria that led them to a complete shit show. Local admin, things of that nature, not having patch management, not having continuity of business. In some cases, having 15 separate directories across a business with all those extremes. But to more directly answer your question, yes, soft skills, people skills are desperately needed. And we talked about this yesterday on the InfoSec hiring panel or employment panel, where it's probably the one thing that's more desperately needed than anything else, because more often than not, a lot of security conversations, especially red team and pen testing engagements, become completely adversarial. To the point, this is how extreme I've seen pen testing in the past. I have seen a Fortune 50 company hire a law firm that then hired another law firm that then hired the pen testers, completed their engagement. The second law firm then redacted anything that they thought the board would not like to see, presented it to the other law firm, changed all the logos as if it was a product of that law firm, then presented it to the company in legal. Legal reviewed it again, provided any notes, and a final draft was done after red lines, and that was presented to the board as a prophylactic measure to make sure that the board, when they were speaking to the press or to their investors, would not have to speak about these findings. And I found that to be more of a criticism of pen testing than of the business. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so what I get from that whole chain is that it's not what you do.
It's how you do it.
It's how you do it. How you
Yeah. No, and you're spot on. Fundamentally, it's can you be mature enough to come to people and say, here's a really bad thing? And actually, the example that's freshest in my head, and Jeff mentioned it yesterday, was he was at Chrysler and talking about the Jeep recall over the cellular compromise that happened where you could stop the brakes or what have you. And that impacted 7% of profit, net profit, not gross. Which, I mean, if you ever work in a business or talk to a CFO of a publicly traded company, they're happy sometimes with a tiny sliver of profit. 7% of your net profit being lost for a publicly traded company, that could impact your entire market cap for 2, 3, 4 years. That's not an exaggeration. And in some cases, a program manager might resign over that due to just the stress of, I've built this entire product and every screw had to be accounted for, and if I added 4 more bolts to a transmission, it equated to $5 million more to my product line over 20 years. And now you're telling me I need to rip out all these Bosch components and all these other things and do some fundamental re-architecture. But giving them a professional, respectful presentation, showing them all of the math and the monetary damage that was incurred by that technical and operational debt was just a game changer for them. So any other questions? One second. That's awful that I'm spacing his first name. And to be fair, I was introduced to Hubbard in college, so it's a little... So if you Google risk and Hubbard, he's the first thing that comes up in Amazon. It's called the failure of risk management. I'm waiting for it to load. Sorry, guys. I have one bar. I blame AT&T at the moment. It's not loading. I apologize, guys. I was thinking of in defiance of the gods. But I can definitely get that to you, or if you just search that. If you just search Risk, Hubbard, and Amazon, it'll come up. Douglas W. Hubbard. So thank you, everyone. If there's any other comments and questions, I'd love to talk to you guys. I hope this was productive. I hope this was helpful. And I'd love to talk to you guys about it further anytime. My email is stits@adobe.com, so tits with an S in front of it at adobe.com. And thank you so much. I really appreciated your time today. It was an absolute pleasure.